Autonomic nervous system, chapter 15. The purpose of this chapter is to examine the structure and function of the autonomic nervous system, compare and contrast the somatic and autonomic nervous system, examine the autonomic system neurotransmitters, and compare and contrast the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Comparison of the somatic and the autonomic nervous systems. So the somatic nervous system includes sensory and motor neurons. Sensory neurons are related to touch, pain, temperature, and proprioception. In other words, the sense of self-position, sight, hearing, taste, smell, and equilibrium. Motor neurons innervate skeletal muscle. On the other hand, the autonomic nervous system receives input from sensory receptors located in organs, blood vessels, muscles, and the nervous system. So you can see there's a little bit of a contrast between the two different types of nervous systems that we have. Comparison of somatic and autonomic nervous systems. So this is figure 15.1 on page 548. The axon of a single myelinated somatic neuron extends from the central nervous system to the skeletal muscle fiber it innervates. So this is an important point that we see here from the spinal cord. The somatic motor neuron is going directly to the skeletal muscle, where it has conversation or it tells the skeletal muscle it needs to flex and do a certain job. That's the somatic nervous system. Comparison of the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. Most autonomic motor pathways consist of two motor neurons in series. There's what we call a preganglionic neuron, and it has the cell body in the central nervous system, and the axon extends to an autonomic ganglion. The postganglionic neuron has its unmyelinated axon extending from the ganglion to the effector. So back to figure 15.1. So this is what that previous slide was just saying. So basically, here's your spine. You've got your spinal cord, and then you've got these ganglions. Oh, this is a gland, actually. Ganglion, a gland, and then another ganglion here. So we talked about the ganglions. They're just groups of cell bodies. That's basically all, or neuron cell bodies. That's all that they are. And we can see here that coming from the spinal cord on these autonomic nerves, they are myelinated until they get to the ganglion. So preganglionic. So what that means is that before the neuron reaches the ganglion, we call that preganglionic. And then of course postganglionic for after it passes through the ganglion and it's myelinated, and then post it's unmyelinated. And here it shows it goes to these effectors, which are the various organs. And that's another thing that the slides didn't say, was that mostly the autonomic nervous system is for your involuntary muscles, things that you can't consciously control. Now, there are some exceptions to that, of course, because your skeletal muscle has some innervation, for your posture and your support and your equilibrium and stuff. And the book points out that people who are very sophisticated with their yoga practice have the ability to have some control over these autonomic systems. But for the most part, most people have no control over their autonomic nervous system. It's just completely involuntary. And here's another point that we need to look at here, is that one of the purposes of this chapter was we were going to identify these neurotransmitters. So we see here that in this ganglion for this autonomic motor neuron, acetylcholine, remember we talked about that several chapters ago, is the preferred neurotransmitter here. And this NE, by the time it gets to these organs, the neurotransmitter is norepinephrine. Now, the neurotransmitters help the signal coming from the nerve to do what we call synapse, which just means that it's allowing that electrical charge to pass from one neuron to the next. In order for it to do that, as you will recall from several chapters ago, that we need some sort of a neurotransmitter. We see here acetylcholine working as the neurotransmitter, synapsing, And then also, by the time we get to the end of the postganglionic neuron, we're using one called norepinephrine. Secondly, here we see where it goes and it talks to a gland. We're still myelinated preganglion. And then from this gland, we get this epinephrine or this norepinephrine as a transmitter. And most glands are going to release like a hormone. So your spinal cord is telling this gland that this could be an adrenal gland or pituitary, whatever gland it might be, but we see that the physiology of it's the same, that we have this particular neurotransmitter in this gland that directs the gland to release some sort of hormone, and then that's going to make it into the blood vessel there. And then finally here, where we are looking at the parasympathetic, remember what we said, that the autonomic nervous system is really divided into two. So for every nerve that you have, you're going to have like double the amount of nerves, because you'll have one autonomic nerve that's dedicated to the parasympathetic and the other autonomic nerve that's dedicated to the sympathetic. So this one here is dedicated to the parasympathetic. The two previous ones here, this one and this one, are dedicated to the sympathetic. And we see here that what the big difference is in the neurotransmitter. Well, no, there's more than, that's not the only difference, obviously, but that's one way that we can tell physiologically between the two types of nerves that are coming in. For instance, if we look here, look, it's basically the same. You've got the signal coming out through a myelinated neuron. All right, we have that here and we have that here. But then we get to a ganglion or a gland. And then post-ganglionic, we are unmyelinated, much like we are here. What's the big difference here? Well, the parasympathetic is going to communicate with these organs as a neurotransmitter, the acetylcholine, as opposed to the neurotransmitters that these guys are using to communicate with the organs. So this is an important point that you need to take home, because in general, the sympathetic nervous system is what we call a fight or flight, and then the parasympathetic is rest or digest. So where the sympathetic neuron is going to increase the heart rate, the parasympathetic is going to tell the heart that it needs to beat less, it needs to calm down, rest and digest. So it's going to come up more on more slides. So let's see what's next. That's exactly what I was saying. So the comparison of the two nervous systems, the autonomic nervous system is divided into two divisions. The sympathetic nervous system is often referred to as the fight or flight division because its stimulation leads to the increased alertness and metabolism to be ready for an emergency. What the book uses, it looks like, on that page 546, that picture, it doesn't have a figure number. It's just a picture. It looks like a guy's climbing a tree. That looks like a dog, but I can't really tell. Anyway, a dog that can climb a tree, maybe. But anyway, you see the guy's, he's acting, or maybe it's real, I don't know, but he's acting like he's scared. His fight or flight's kicked in, so he's obviously in flight mode and being backed up a tree. If that animal, whatever kind of animal it is, continues to come at him, he might go into his fight because he doesn't have any other resource. So fight or flight, if I have an emergency, if something's threatening me, I stand my ground, I move into it, or I get the heck out of the way, I run. And then the parasympathetic nervous system is referred to as rest and digest, as its stimulation slows down most body activity. So there's a couple exceptions to that will come up later during the lecture. So here's just a table 15.1 on page 549. And this table is the comparison of the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. And it just kind of puts it in the context for you. So you can go through this and see how the item, the sensory input, the control of the motor input, or the motor neuron pathway, how they differ from the somatic nervous system to the autonomic nervous system. The anatomy of the autonomic motor pathways. Each division of the autonomic nervous system has two motor neurons, the preganglionic the cell body in the brain or the spinal cord, and the postganglionic, the cell body and dendrites located in an autonomic ganglion where it synapses with the preganglionic axons. So I kind of already described that to you a couple slides ago in more layman's terms. But just remember that anything that happens before the autonomic nerve gets to a ganglion is what we call preganglionic, and then anything that happens after that is postganglionic. And preganglionic, it's going to be myelinated, and postganglionic, it's going to be unmyelinated. Anatomy of autonomic motor pathways continued. In the sympathetic division, the cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons are in the lateral horns of the gray matter in the 12th thoracic and first, second, or third lumbar segments. Yeah. Page 551, figure 15.2. Here's our thoracic portion of our spine, and here's our lumbar portion of our spine. So our autonomic motor pathways are originating from this part of our spine. Okay, so virtually, well, not the exact center, but pretty much in the middle, because see, we got down here, we got more lumbar, and then we've got our sacral section and our coccyx, and then here we've got the cervical part. So our autonomic motor nerves are coming from this part of the body, and then you can see all of the different organs that they affect. These are what we call our visceral organs. So the visceral organs, this is another vocab word that's going to come up later in the chapter, but your visceral organs are like your soft internal organs, your vital organs. Those are what we call our viscera. Anatomy of autonomic motor pathways continued. In the parasympathetic division, cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons are in the nuclei of the four cranial nerves, in the brainstem, and in the lateral gray matter from the sacral segments 2 to 4 of the spinal cord. Again, a very similar diagram here. This is page 552, figure 15.3. So what we call this parasympathetic setup here is we would term this cranial sacral, because it deals with both the cranium and then the sacral part of the spinal cord. And you can then, again, you can see there all of the pathways that the nerves take from the cranium and from the sacral portion of the spine to the various organs. There are two types of autonomic ganglia, sympathetic and parasympathetic. There are two major types of sympathetic ganglia: the sympathetic trunk ganglia, which lie in a vertical row on either side of the vertebral column. The prevertebral ganglia, they lie interior to the vertebral column and close to the large abdominal arteries. Like anything in anatomy, we want to give it a name. So most of the ganglia that you're going to come into contact with will have a name that's probably most likely cogent to the artery that it's nearest. Okay, so that's generally how they, now, of course, just like in Spanish class, you're going to find your irregular verbs, and in anatomy, there's going to be some stuff that doesn't exactly follow that rule, but that's a good general rule of thumb. Most ganglia is named for the artery that it's in closest proximity to. So after axons of the sympathetic preganglionic neurons enter the sympathetic trunk ganglia, they may connect with postganglionic neurons in one of four ways. An axon may synapse with the postganglionic neuron in the first ganglion it reaches. An axon may ascend or descend to a higher or lower ganglion before synapsing with the postganglionic neuron. 3. An axon may continue without synapsing through the sympathetic trunk to the end of the prevertebral ganglion and synapse with postganglionic neurons. 4. An axon may also pass without synapsing through the synaptic trunk ganglion and the prevertebral ganglion and then extend to the adrenal medulla. Let's have a closer look at figure 15.4 on page 553. So that's exactly what that previous slide said. So we've got the sympathetic chain, right? And we can see here that the signal is coming out to the spinal nerve. And this is just basically showing you that in this ganglion, the signal can go up. It can go right straight through. It can synapse here. So this is where the synapse is going to occur. It's almost like, for lack of a better analogy, it's almost like the post office. If you're in Chicago and I'm in Chicago Heights, and I want to write you a snail mail letter and I take it to the post office, that's going to go through a processing and it's going to go through a different route. Or if you're living in Chicago Heights and I'm living in Chicago Heights and I write you a snail mail letter, take it to the post office, it's just going to go like this, right? The letter's just going to go zip right through there. But if you're living in Chicago or you're living in Terre Haute, then that signal, that letter analogy, remember it's just an analogy, will go through these ganglions and find the appropriate way for it to affect one of these organs, right? That's really all that this slide is saying, that these ganglions, it's like a distribution center. But that's basically what this is. It's really literally like a post office, like a distributor cap. It's just a distribution center for your nerve signals so they can get to the right place and affect the right function or organ or muscle, so you can do the right thing you need to do at the time, whether it's fight or flight or whether it's rest and digest. The abdomen and pelvis contain major autonomic plexuses, which are often named after the artery along which they are distributed. I already said that, just not in those terms. These include the celiac solar plexus, the superior mesenteric plexus, the inferior mesenteric plexus, the renal plexus, and the hypogastric plexus. So here we see that on page 555, figure 15.5. Well, that's a lot of fives. 15.5, 555. Cool. The ganglions here. And then you come up to these plexuses, and it's just named for the artery that it is in conjunction with, or closest to in most cases. Cell bodies of the sympathetic preganglionic neurons are part of the lateral gray horns of all thoracic segments and the first two lumbar segments of the spinal. Actually, that's wrong. It's actually the first three lumbar segments. So make sure you got that right. And that's, I already pointed that out to you anyway in figure 15.2 on page 551. You can see that the sympathetic preganglionic neurons go down to lumbar number 3. Anyway, just a typo. The paired sympathetic trunk ganglion are anterior and lateral to the vertebral column. Usually there are 2 cervical, 11 or 12 thoracic, 4 or 5 lumbar, 4 or 5 sacral sympathetic trunk ganglion, and 1 coccygeal ganglion. Cell bodies of the parasympathetic preganglionic neurons are located in the nuclei in the brainstem and in the lateral gray matter of the 2nd through 4th sacral segments of the spinal cord. The cranial parasympathetic outflow extends from the brainstem in 4 cranial nerves. The sacral parasympathetic outflow extends from the 2nd through 4th sacral spinal nerve. Figure 15.6 on page 557. And well, the gray matter is here, and this is the white matter around the outside. And you can see here that this posterior root leading to this ganglion is the signal is being derived from the gray matter. And then it shows it on its way. When your book is indicating something in the red, this is parasympathetic. Okay, it even says down here in the key. All right. So that's basically how the signal works. It's going to come out of the gray matter, and it's going to go through the neuron, through the ganglion, and it's going to find its way to whatever organ it needs to affect. Autonomic nervous system, neurotransmitters, and receptors. Based on the neurotransmitter they produce and release, autonomic neurons are considered either cholinergic or adrenergic. Cholinergic neurons release neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Cholinergic receptors include the nicotine receptors and the muscarinic receptors. Adrenic neurons release norepinephrine or noradrenaline. And we can see that here on page 558, figure 15.7. And we were kind of already talking about this before, but now we're actually focusing specifically on the neurotransmitter. So remember, several slides ago, I had pointed out to you how the different kinds of neuroreceptors were affecting the different types of the system, whether it's sympathetic or the parasympathetic. So we can see here that the parasympathetic is always dealing with acetylcholine, and the sympathetic deals with either acetylcholine or norepinephrine. This is also, I'd like to point out, these nicotine receptors, and I'm pretty sure that this is one of the reasons why smoking is addictive or tobacco use becomes addictive, is because the nicotine, what it's going to do is it's going to stimulate these receptors, and that's going to increase your acetylcholine. I always say that, smoking, don't smoke. Even I'm a non-smoker. I've done it in the past, but don't smoke anything. It's bad for you. And this is one of the reasons why it can become addictive. But smoking, it's like the law of diminishing returns. A young person, when they start smoking, they get a buzz off. I remember the first time I got a buzz, even with something as simple as nicotine. And not even talking about weed or all the other crazy stuff you can smoke. Just talking about cigarettes, cigars, whatever. Go ahead and take a drag and see what happens. If you're not a regular smoker, it's going to give you a buzz. You can feel something, and it can give you more energy, because think about it. All it is energy, right? I mean, heat is energy, and you light it and you're converting that nicotine into some sort of energy that you're inhaling. What's the difference if you're eating a carrot? If you're eating a carrot, you're getting energy from that carrot because you need the carrot, right? And when you smoke that cigarette or that weed or whatever, you're getting energy from it because you're taking that organic matter and you're converting it into energy. And that's going to affect your body. And or at least I found with nicotine that, it did give me more energy at first. I mean, don't get me wrong, I haven't smoked since I was in my 20s, and it's been a long time. I'm glad that I was able to quit. I know people who struggle with it. So I encourage you now, if you're young and you're smoking, please just quit. I mean, it's the best thing you can do, and it's easier to do it now than later when you get older. Anyway, enough of that soapbox. I'm trying to give you some facts here that smoking, well, it is energy. And, I used to go out, I was on the track team, right? Go out and sneak a smoke before I ran, because I knew I could run faster, right? At first. But there's always that law of diminishing return. Eventually, these receptors, they become insensitive to it. And you need more and more of that nicotine to get the same effect that you had before. That's why it becomes addictive. That's why it's hard to quit, because those receptors in these ganglia, they're saying, hey, we need nicotine, because that's how it's used to functioning. People who've been smoking their whole lives. My grandpa was a smoker. There was no way he could quit. And he did quit. And I think that, when he quit, when he was in his 70s, I think that's probably what killed him, quitting, because he was so used to it. He'd been smoking since he was 10 years old. It was a lot different in those days. Even when I was a kid, I could go to the gas station and buy cigarettes at 13, 14 years old. I was going to the gas station and buying. You can't do that anymore, which is good. But, back in those days, and especially during my grandpa's generation, geez, his parents probably just let him have it. They thought for the longest time that smoking was healthy. That was the kind of the thought up through the 50s, and, that started changing in the 60s, the 1960s. But yeah, it's just, smoking's bad news. It's addictive, and it affects these neurotransmitters. Now, smoking things like weed, there may be some trace amounts of nicotine in weed. Like I always say, if you're trying to quit smoking, then try to increase your intake of tomatoes, because tomatoes are a little bit higher in nicotine than some of the other plants. So that's a good way to kind of supplement that. But, just do your research on it. Figure out what foods that you can buy at the store or that you can grow in your garden are higher in nicotine, and then try to supplement those. But things like marijuana and, all the other stuff out there that you can smoke, those aren't going to be having nicotine in them, though there may be some trace amounts. That's why marijuana is not addictive in the same way. I believe that marijuana is addictive. I can make arguments for it, but it's more of a psychological addiction. I do know people who, if you're not addicted to that, I don't know what addiction is. But it's not like heroin, where when you quit heroin, you get sick. when you quit smoking marijuana, I don't know. It's I've never been addicted to heroin, so I can't really speak to that. But I know that from some people I've known who have had that problem, and some of the documentaries I've seen on TV, I know that it's a hard drug to quit, and it makes you sick because it's a different kind of addiction. But I still think that marijuana is addictive, and again, it's not doing your lung and your tidal capacity any good. We haven't talked about tidal capacity yet. You'll talk about it in AMP2, but your tidal capacity of your lungs, the more you smoke, the more that goes down, and that means that you have a harder time taking in oxygen, or you can't take in as much oxygen. That's why then you see these people who have been smoking for 10, 20, 30 years. They'd be lucky if they could run around the block and not get winded, because or even not even a block, just run out to the mailbox maybe. You know what I'm saying? It gets harder and harder to do that stuff, and you start to lose energy that way. That's what I'm saying. With those smoking things, it's a point of no return. You're going to get some energy from it, yeah, because it's that's what it is. When you light up, you're converting that energy into energy, and your body's taking that energy and doing something else with it, whatever it is. But you're eventually going to get to a point of diminishing returns, and it's going to affect you in negative ways. And I would advocate for you to look at running the marathon as opposed to just sprinting. But hey, it's your life, and I can't use this whole lecture for talking about smoking, but I do encourage you to quit if you are smoking. So here's the receptors of the ANS, and that is found on page 559, table 15.2. So we already talked about some of these, and you can see their major locations here, and then the effects of the receptor activation. So, so here's exactly what I was talking about with these nicotinic receptors. So that's why that nicotine, when you smoke, because it excites these nerve impulses, it stimulates you, it gives you energy. That's why it becomes so addictive. You can go down the whole thing here and just see where all of these receptors, where they're located and their effects. And now I know that some of them are going to come up. They don't know much about them. Which one is it? I saw it in here earlier. It must be on another, maybe it's on these. So this is a comparison of the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. This is page 561, table 15.3. So you've got this characteristic, how it's distributed, and then the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic. So remember what we said, that the sympathetic nervous system is generated from the thoracic vertebrae and the lumbar, the first three lumbar vertebrae. That's where the sympathetic is derived from. So we call that thoracolumbar. And then of course the parasympathetic, we already said, is what we call craniosacral. Okay. So yeah, you could just go through these and you can see, how are they distributed. So mating to the head and to the viscera, the thorax, abdomen, wide regions of the body, skin, sweat glands. So you could go through these. So let's go and talk about this autonomic tone. Autonomic tone is the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system activity. It's regulated by the hypothalamus. It affects body organs differently. When the sympathetic input increases, the parasympathetic decreases, and vice versa. So that's why they're kind of like the sympathetic and the parasympathetic are almost like yin and yang. So here's a great example is I'm going for lunch. I want to go get some lunch, right? I get in my car and I almost get in a wreck and it kills my appetite. That's because that fight or flight's kicking into me. It's like, yeah, oh my gosh. It's an emergency, it changed me for a minute. And then the parasympathetic is just nixed, it's like now all of a sudden I lost my appetite. Or if I did just have lunch, now all of a sudden the parasympathetic's been nixed, shut down, stopped, whatever you want to say, and your digestion is suspended. So now where I'm, I went somewhere and got me a sandwich, ate my sandwich, got in my car, and then an emergency, something happened. I kicked into fight or flight. Now I'm kind of sedentary, driving in my car, my food's digesting, but all of a sudden, wow, now my food's not digesting. So that's just a broad example of that. Yeah, 15.4, page 562. This is the last table in the chapter, so this was probably the one I was thinking of. Let's see here. So the effects of the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system on glands. Some of it we don't know. We don't know the effect at this point in time. Now, that doesn't mean that we will never know the effect. It just means right now there's some unknown stuff about the nervous system. So there's still room to do research on it and learn more about it. And you could just go through this table here. Oh, yeah, okay, vasoconstriction. I wanted to talk about that. Yeah, see, so the sympathetic nervous system, it affects your sex organs. So I thought that this says vasodilation, erection. Yeah, so I thought that was more unique to males than the female, but it is right because the clitoris and the penis are what we call homologs. For the male anyway, the vasodilation helps the penis to become erect, and then the sympathetic help him to ejaculate. And the reason I'm pointing out this one in particular is because it's important, because remember what I've been saying all along is that the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, they're like yin and yang, right? If one is affecting an organ, the other one is not. Like I was given the example of when I went for a sandwich, or I'm going for a sandwich and something happens to me and it kicks my fight or flight in, and then I lose my appetite. See, that's a great example because my digestive system has been cut off because I'm in rest or digest, parasympathetic, right? So this is one where they have to work together, because in order for the male to perform his reproductive function, he has to be able to have the erection and the ejaculation. So at that point, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic are coming together and working together. Now, that's not necessarily a true state. I guess that he can't ejaculate without an erection, and that's some technical stuff that you will learn when you get to AMP2, but it does help for reproduction. So I'll just leave it there. Okay, integration and control of autonomic functions. Functions such as heart rate and force of ventricular contraction, blood pressure, and blood vessel diameter are controlled by autonomic reflexes that occur when nerve impulses pass through an autonomic reflex arc. The reflex arc is composed of a receptor, a sensory neuron, an integrating center, motor neurons, and an effector. So all an effector is the organ. Like if it's affecting the heart is the effector. This is on page 564, focused on homeostasis, and then it just goes through and tells us how the autonomic nervous system helps your body to maintain its homeostasis. Disorders with the autonomic nervous system. You got the autonomic dysreflexia, which is an exaggerated response of the sympathetic nervous system occurring in 85% of individuals with spinal cord injury at or above T6. If untreated, it can cause seizures, heart attack, or stroke. And then the Raynaud phenomenon, which occurs due to excessive sympathetic stimulation of smooth muscle in the arterioles of digits. Arteriole is like, we haven't talked about circular, but it's part of the circular system. The arteries, they get a little bit smaller. So it's just a small artery, really. That's all that it is. Vasoconstriction leads to numbness and ischemia in the digits. So that's just where you can't feel your digits. Again, in diagnosis, if you're working on, you want to go into the clinic, if I've got numbness in my extreme digits here in my hand, the first thing I would be thinking is a carpal tunnel or a radial tunnel or something, which is also affected by a nerve. But this Raynaud, so how would you diagnose that? So that's going to require a little bit more study and a little bit more testing. And I'm just saying, with many illnesses, if you are planning to go into the medical field, that there are many disorders, illnesses, they have similar signs and symptoms. Like fever. I mean, if your body's invaded by a microorganism, some foreign invader, that your fever is going to go up. So I can just tell, Well, you got a fever, so you got a bacterial infection or a viral infection, probably. That's, I mean, that's the challenge of the medical professionals, is that they've got to run all these tests and be spot on with their diagnosis so they can get you the best treatment. And people have had problems like this, and if they're diagnosed wrong, it can create more problems for them. Okay, well, that's tonight's lecture for you.